am currently the Assistant Director of Financial Management at Nottingham University Hospitals, and I've spent the last 13.5 years working in NHS finance. Hopefully you were expecting to be on the Understanding Budgets workshop. What I'm intending to cover is essentially going back to basics. What is a budget? Why do we have them? What types of budgets there are? What are the different approaches to budget setting and how to go about budget setting for your areas? Then touching a bit on quality improvement and waste reduction and how to build that into budget setting processes. And then the second half will be more about budget terminology, how to read your budgets, and then why managing your budgets effectively is important. I like to run sessions quite interactively, so if you've got any questions as we go along, please do shout out, put your hand up, put some chat in the chat box, whatever. I'll try and respond to as many queries as possible, and there will be some sort of interactive parts of this. So if I get started. So essentially, a budget is a financial plan for a defined period. Usually, well, particularly in the NHS, we set budgets from year to year. We are trying to move more towards future planning and going into sort of 3-year budget setting rounds. And this year's planning guidance extends some of at least the payment mechanisms and the contracts for a couple of years. But it still includes a caveat for review at that break point between the years. So effectively, what do we budget for? We've got planned activity levels that we want to deliver within the services. And with that comes planned levels of income, sometimes aligned to the activity, sometimes aligned to other services that are delivered. We have to budget for the resource quantities. That can be from staffing to facilities, sessions within theatre, outpatients, that sort of thing. And then expenditure requirements. So if you've got any changes year to year from that perspective, inflation being one of them. And in this year's planning guidance, the inflation factor is set at 2%, but tends to get funded for whatever the pay award that gets approved turns out at. From a non-pay perspective, the average is around about 4% for inflation for this year in the planning guidance. And then on top of that, we overlay efficiency requirements. So why do you think we have a budget? Essentially, each NHS organisation has a legal responsibility to break even. So it's not just the responsibility of the Director of Finance. It is the responsibility of all staff and all budget holders within the trust to ensure that each organisation manages to break even. The budget should align to the annual plan, and that includes all of the key access targets, all of the other key targets that are within the annual planning guidance each year. The budget should be set up to enable you to deliver all your operational targets. And it also provides a forecast of income and expenditure. So essentially, management decisions can be made off of the back of the budgets that are put into place. And it's also a means to monitor budget holders' individual performance. So you are set a target at the start of the year, and I'm sure within your organisations there are various performance management regimes that will have a monthly meeting with yourselves and then ask you to explain where you're off track, why you're off track, and what is going to be done in order to get back round to the desired performance levels. So within that, there are different types of budgets. So revenue will be the one that you're probably most familiar with, and that includes sort of pay budgets, non-pay budgets for anything from theatre consumables to, pens, letters to patients, that sort of thing. There's capital budgets, which are not devolved out to the usual budget holder level, and there's usually a central control around those budgets. So they'll be managed through various investment governance committees, but they are also key in enabling yourselves to deliver against your financial operational targets, but also financial targets in year. Because as I said before, that with the resource budgets, you need to make sure that you've got sufficient capacity, be that from medical equipment or physical capacity in terms of number of theatres, wards, outpatients, in order to deliver the operational plans. And so you'll have processes within your organisations whereby you can access capital expenditure budgets in order to facilitate the operational needs of your services. And then the final one, establishment, and I've said about pay costs, but this is more about positions and people in positions, making sure that you've got the right people in the right positions. So you'll have an overall pay budget, but it will be around making sure that you've got safe staffing establishments on your wards, and making sure that you've got enough staff to deliver the activity that goes within your plan and then meets the service specifications for your services. So there's different approaches to budget setting. First one, top-down budget setting, is essentially an exercise whereby senior managers within an organisation will set a plan that they then devolve out to budget holders and budget managers within the organisation. And essentially, these tend to be high-level plans because the senior managers don't have the level of detail. Can anyone think of any benefits to that sort of approach, whereby senior leadership within a healthcare organisation would set the budgets and devolve them out to the budget holders? No.
It can maintain complete control.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, so you can. So the senior leaders can ensure that the total quantum of the budgets that are devolved come back to the total quantum that they need to be able to deliver on the hospital's financial break-even position. That's right.
There'll be a strategic element to it, so that they would see kind of more of the broader picture of what's needed.
That's it. So the senior leaders are better, have a better view of the overall strategic direction that they want to take the organisation in. So often, if you're budget setting at a lower level, you'll focus internally on your department and what's best for your department, but you won't necessarily think about how that impacts on the other departments, and how that links into the overall strategy. That's not always the case, but you do tend to get a better alignment to the overall organisational strategy with a top-down approach. The other benefit that I would say is it is less time consuming than a bottom-up budget. So it's a lot quicker. You don't have to go through rounds and rounds of sort of discussions about what you can have, what you can't have. The senior leaders are then able to devolve out a budget that then is reflective of what they want to deliver within the envelope that they want to deliver it. Can you see any drawbacks to a top-down budget setting approach?
Isn't it very sort of dictatorial, and there may not be an understanding of the constraints at a more granular level, so it might not actually be achievable?
That's right. So as well as the senior leaders being closer to the strategic objectives of the organisation, they are then more distant from the actual detail of the operations, where a budget holder will be able to feed in a lot more of that detail and be aware of potential risks that need to be addressed, any barriers to delivery on certain operational targets that would need to be addressed through the budget setting that may be overlooked at a senior level. So that's definitely one element. Anything else that you can think of? How would it make you feel as a budget holder if a senior leader came to you and told you, you had, I don't know, a budget of 1.6 million the previous year. We've just taken your last year's budget, we've rolled it forward, and we've applied an efficiency factor, and we want you to deliver the same services for 1.5 million. And then they've overlooked the fact that there's specific inflation perhaps within your area. I don't know, you work in ophthalmology and the cost of a cornea has doubled year on year, and therefore the effective efficiency factor is something more like 300,000 than 100,000. How would that make you feel as a budget holder?
I think I'd feel pretty disappointing that they didn't have that conversation with you, because as somebody who's on the shop floor and obviously managing that day-to-day budget, you know, you would at least have thought they would have the professional courtesy to have that discussion, to highlight any potential problems and then come to some sort of compromise.
That's it. It's really demotivating when you're just given a target and there's no sort of two-way interaction between yourselves and the senior management team. You don't get the opportunity to explain the barriers that you're up against, and it kind of downplays the role of and the importance of the budget holder and budget manager. So that is a real significant drawback to a top-down approach. And so, in my opinion, they have a time and a place when there is an absolute crisis and something has to be done in really quick time. But it is not a great way to get engagement of budget holders, budget managers, and to an extent, bottom up is far better. I mean, you probably worked out for yourselves that bottom up is exactly the opposite of a top down. Essentially, that is where the budget holder themselves gets the chance to propose a budget for the next financial period that would enable them to deliver on all of their operational plan targets and service specifications. Usually it's iterative, so it's unlikely that as a budget holder you would take a budget unless it was, you know, considered to be, well, usually it would have to be better than last year's budget in order to, or more financially efficient than last year's budget. That makes sense, in order for the senior leadership team to just say, okay, that's great, we'll sign that off. Usually there's a process of sort of review, challenge, we go back and we go around that cycle at least once or twice before you kind of negotiate a position on the final budget. What do you think the sort of benefits to that are? I mean, I think we're probably flipping round the pros and cons of the last one. The only thing that I can sort of think to add is that the bottom-up process, if you go through too many iterations and too much challenge, I can imagine that is also quite demotivating. So whilst the top-down can be thoroughly demotivating for teams, so it's important not to overlook the fact that can be the case with a bottom-up process as well. So yeah, incremental budget setting essentially is the process of you take last year's budget and you roll it forward into this year, and then you adjust it for any known changes. So things like inflation, you make an uplift for the pay award, you make an uplift for any non-pay inflation that's been funded through the funding settlement, and then any known sort of service developments, if any services cease, any changes to sort of service reconfigurations, and playing through the full year effects of last year's efficiency program and that sort of thing. So it's very much just building on last year's base, and it tends to be in fixed periods. So you would update your iterative budget from last year to this year, and then you wouldn't then revisit it until the following planning rounds, with no adjustments in between to reflect any changes in the intervening period. That has its merits. Essentially, this is probably the most common form of budget setting that you find in the NHS, and one of the merits of it is it's quicker than going back and looking at everything from scratch. A drawback on the flip side of that is it means that it embeds either inefficiencies from the prior year or pressures from the prior year that, if unresolved through the corrections in the in that process, then they get ignored and baked into the following year's budgets and can only then be reviewed a year further down the line. So you could end up with a budget that isn't reflective of what the service needs to deliver that service, but because you've baked it in for another year, then sort of demotivates the budget holder and the team from actually delivering against it, because you start off with an unrealistic plan, and so it's less motivating to then try and hit it and deliver as effectively as possible against it. A zero based is the opposite. So this is where you effectively, so say you manage ophthalmology, for example, you say, right, okay, what's the level of demand for the service for this year? You've got your non-elective demand that will come through eye casualty, and you can work out the non-elective capacity that you require. Then you can factor through, what's my referrals in from the GPs, how many of those will convert into an outpatient first. You then look at your sort of metrics, how many of those outpatients first are likely to convert into an inpatient spell and surgery. And then, what's the average length of stay? How many beds do I need to house the patients once they've had surgery? And so that's how you start factoring that sort of thing in. And then working back from that, how many theatres do I need to deliver that level of activity? How many outpatient clinics do I need to deliver on the first? And then following on from the surgery, how many do I need to cover the follow-ups? And the follow-ups at the moment, it tends to be an increasing trend because of the increase in waiting in backlogs or waiting lists, sorry, or length of time on waiting list. I should have been a bit more precise in the language. So yeah, it's factoring all of that in to determine what capacity that you need. And then once you've determined the capacity, it's then costing that capacity up. So how many staff do you need? How many surgeons do you need for the theatre sessions and theatre sessions in their job plans? How many clinics do you need to run? So they all the staffing that are surrounding those clinics, and then you work back, and you can see that it's you're most likely to get the most accurate budget, but it's a very time-consuming exercise to undertake, and that tends to be why it's not an exercise that is undertaken every year. What tends to happen, from my experience, and it may be different at different trusts, is that you'll go along for sort of 2-3 years on the incremental basis, building on last year's budget. Then it will get to a point where that budget is no longer reflective of what it takes to deliver that service. And at that point, we go back to, or close to, a zero-based budget setting process, whereby we go, okay, well, let's rethink this. What do we actually need to deliver it? Build that budget up, and then start again from scratch. And then you go back through the incremental process. That's my sort of experience. There's definite pros to zero-based budgeting. It requires a lot of buy-in from the service, not just the budget holder, but also the people that are involved. It builds in maximum efficiency, and also forces you to rethink the pathways. So it forces you to look at every single step in the pathway for a patient, so to make sure that it's a necessary step, that it is the most effective way to treat them, and so that's the best way to build the most efficient service, and a budget that reflects that as well. A rolling budget is very much along similar lines to the incremental budgets, but it's one that is continuously updated for known changes. So essentially, rather than setting your budget at the start of one year and then not revisiting it until the end of the next year, essentially, if events occur in the interim period, you update for it. So I don't know, say you recognise that you don't have sufficient staffing in order to deliver the activity plan, and in order to do something in year, you would need to then recruit into, I don't know how many more surgeons or nurses or other support staff in order to deliver that activity. You would then build in the budget in the mid-year point and then the additional activity into your plans all as you go. So it's it's a better way to keep the budget slightly more up to date than the incremental method, but it can be, again, time consuming and doesn't give you sort of a steady state to then review against. The last one is activity based. So it's a bit like the zero based method, but what it does is it factors in all the support services as well. So how familiar are you with sort of service line reporting and indirect costs? So I've seen a few shakes of heads. So SLR reporting or service line reporting and activity-based budget setting attempts to bring in indirect costs of your services. So say, for example, if I take the ophthalmology example again, the likelihood is if you're the service manager for ophthalmology, you would only have budgets that relate to ophthalmology. But the reality of the impact of the ophthalmology service is it impacts on outpatients, which presumably will be run by a different budget manager, theatres, potentially if the wards are shared, a different service there. And what the activity-based costing, it looks at the activity and it builds out. So basically you need refined patient level information so that you know exactly how much cost relates to each individual bit of activity, so that you can then take those elements of the costs, so for theatres, for outpatients, for all of the support services, maybe pathology, diagnostics, and then you use that to build out all of those support services budgets as well. Rather than rolling forward their budgets each year, you then use the activity base to build out both on the direct costs that you control, so that's the zero based bit, but also on the theatres and the outpatients, diagnostics and that sort of thing. The last bit's pretty complex. Does that make sense how I've sort of explained it? Yeah, sort of. It's difficult to, I don't want to spend the whole session talking about it, but I'm in danger of going down the world of patient level costing, which I think is a different workshop, so I'll save that for another day. But they're the main methods that you can use to approach budget setting anyway. So things to consider, we've sort of gone through quite a lot of these as we were sort of discussing the other methods, but essentially what are the key objectives? So it's factoring in all of the things from the planning guidance that you'll need to achieve. So for this year, from an operational performance perspective, they've reintroduced the 4-hour A&E target, which may impact on staffing needs, bed capacity needs of the organisation, but specifically your departments. Then there's the reduction, so they want to reduce or get to zero 65-week waiters by the end of March 2024. So it's factoring in the amount of activity that you would need to deliver in order to get to that point. Again, with the diagnostic pathways, it's getting back up to 95% of patients being seen or tested within 2 weeks. Again, there's focus on cancer targets, which although the monitoring may have softened, I don't think within trusts that I'm aware of, I don't think that the actual internal focus softened on those. But yeah, they're all the sorts of operational things from the planning guidance that are worth factoring in. The other thing from planning guidance that's worth factoring in is around agency usage. So within this year's planning guidance, there is going to be a target set by Integrated Care Board, but also by trust or organisation to for your agency expenditure to be within 3.7% of your overall pay expenditure. So those sorts of things will need consideration when setting budgets and approaching planning more broadly, because if your services are operating with larger numbers of agent or larger amounts of agency spend as a proportion, then you need to work with your HR colleagues to work out how can you do something differently to avoid agency spend, whether that's through recruitment, retention, incentive payments for bank and overtime, that sort of thing, because that will be more closely monitored this financial year. Again, factoring in things like service specification, it's really key that you understand the sort of payment mechanism for your services. For all tariff-based services this year, the consultation document is indicating that all sort of non-elective pods will be blocked. So any activity that you sign up to in your activity plans will be paid at that blocked value, regardless of over or under performance. Whereas on the planned care points of delivery, so that's your electives, your day case, outpatient first, outpatient procedures, chemo, and I think diagnostics and nuclear medicine, that is all going to be paid at 100% variable rate. Obviously local agreements may vary to that, but that is a key thing to factor into your planning, in that the real risk financially to your services will come from your delivery of the planned care elements. So that's something to factor into budget setting. As I was saying before, what demand is there on the service? So there's obviously the need to reduce down the backlogs to get to the 68-week target, but also, you know, if you're budget manager for ED or one of the related services that are heavily impacted by ED, it's how is that change in the 70, you know, having 76% of patients treated within 4 hours going to impact on your bed capacity needs, and that sort of thing. And then again, in the service specification, I mean, these will vary from area to area, but there will be certain staffing levels, certain criteria that your services will have to meet in order to meet that service spec, and they could incur penalties if you don't. So it's worth understanding all of those. So then it's factoring through, well, what resources do you need to meet those demands? So as we said earlier, you need to make sure you've got access to theatres, to outpatients, to diagnostics. And one of the key things that I find when looking at the way the service is set up is we're very good as an NHS at working out what internally we need as a department, but we don't always factor in the alignment of resources with supporting services. So it's all well and good having, I don't know, consultants with job plans that deliver 30 sessions, but if the theatre teams are only geared up to support 24, you've got 6 sessions there where it just doesn't work. So you're either going to have to put on WLIs at an increased cost, and that's assuming that the theatre teams were able to support that, or you're going to have consultants and which it depends where the misalignment is, but potentially consultants with idle time on their hands because actually they can't deliver the theatre sessions that they were planned to do, which obviously can impact on the morale there. But that goes equally for outpatient clinics, goes for bed-based. So if you haven't got the beds to put the activity in post-operation, then obviously you're still going to create that idle time. And I think one of the things when you're reviewing your service is looking at the capacity you've got from all of those support functions to identify, you know, what is your key constraining factor. You know, if you've got theatre sessions in job plans of 30, theatre lists of 24, but beds to only accommodate 20 sessions per week, the thing you need to address first is the bed capacity, and then work backwards. And that's the key way to sort of try and best model the resources and effectively utilise the resources for services. And again, are those resources available? So say you want to increase your bed base, are you going to be able to recruit to another 20 odd nurses, however many that you need to staff up that ward. Is there a credible plan to get there? So it might be that you start down one approach and you think, oh, I need to increase the capacity here, when actually, if that's not possible, you might need to have a rethink about how things are set up to best or most effectively utilise the resources that you do have. Next, understanding what cost pressures you've got. So I said earlier, if you've got specific pressures for known price increases, they need to be factored in. So it will be different everywhere, but at Nottingham University Hospitals, we go through an exercise within finance that reviews all of the cost pressures in year through what we call budget corrections, as opposed to sort of planning and investments, to say, well, have we got unavoidable cost pressures that have arisen through the items that are out of or issues that are out of our control? And if there are, so things like if the CNST premium goes up, well, there's nothing we can do to reduce that, so we have to reflect that in the plan and then and subsequently in the budget. So it's identifying all of those things and highlighting those at the earliest opportunity so that they can be built into the overall organisation plans. So in terms of identification of waste, there's various different models that you can use to identify different types of waste, but these are some of the key things that we find usually relate to waste. And financial efficiency has got a bit of it's an emotive couple of words. So at NUH we've changed the narrative, and we've moved to what we call quality improvement and waste reduction. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be, pounds out. We're quite happy if we can identify something that improves the quality of the care that we deliver, but doesn't increase the cost concomitantly. So at the same or correspondingly, at the same rate, so that we can actually demonstrate that we are adding value. But it doesn't necessarily mean that has to be a pounds value as well, because ultimately we're here to treat patients. And whilst I've got a finance hat on in my role, the most important thing I think we can, across any sort of staff group, we can agree is delivering the best possible care for our patients, whether that be cost effectively or qualitatively. So in terms of different types of waste, idle time. So, if you've got either patients or staff having to wait around in between steps in the pathway, trying to identify how we can cut those out. Clearly unnecessary movement of staff or patients, organising, this sort of thing that the productive ward rounds looked at quite a while ago, making sure that you don't have unnecessary movement up and down the wards and that sort of thing. Moving patients from area to area, if getting the services as closely geographically located as possible, so that you can move someone from an assessment onto their next appointment as quickly as possible. But also, so at NUH we are a split site. Well, I say split site. We've got two main hospital sites, so it's thinking about if you've got services that are split across the two sites, then clearly there's some embedded inefficiencies, and is there an opportunity to move services onto the one site to get the efficiencies of a single rota, all of that sort of thing, that that there is the potential to unlock if you're all on the same site. I said unnecessary steps in processes, if we're sort of, it's called sort of overhandling, is the sort of management jargon, but if we're doing stuff more often than is necessary, so that could be ordering tests. So one of the things that I looked at in a previous trust was putting in an electronic ordering system, or it was more utilising it, so switching off the ability to process paper-based requests, in order that you could then, for certain tests, if they were ordered within a certain time period, you could just bat them back and say, no, there's no benefit to getting another test processed within such a short time space. So it's those types of things to sort of think about. And again, if you're a budget holder or manager that manages an area that holds inventory, it's reviewing your stock handling processes. Have you got excessive costs in your position from the previous year due to things like stock write-offs because the stock hadn't been rotated, and the stores that you're keeping it in aren't laid out neatly so people can pick the sort of the stock with the closest use by date on it, that sort of thing. So if you can build those processes in, then that gives you a head start on your efficiency programs or quality improvement programs for the following year. Then on understanding, are you delivering something that hasn't been commissioned or funded? And this goes back to, do you understand what you're paid for and how you're paid? Quite often when sort of finance go into review services, we'll look at what's being delivered and compare that to what we're actually getting paid for, and we realise that either through not recording activity or only recording certain parts of the activity, that actually that activity isn't accurately reflected in how we get paid. So it's working with coders, with finance, to understand, if you're doing something to a patient other than just a straightforward attendance and assessment, then you should really be attracting an HRG and therefore either an inpatient or outpatient procedure tariff. And it's one of the things, going back to when I worked at Leicester, we went down to fracture clinic and we realised that all of the activity in fracture clinic was just getting coded at on an attendance basis, but actually a lot of the work that was going on in there was more procedure based. And although at the moment we're working in ICBs where there are financial constraints and we work within an overall envelope, even if it's getting that activity recorded so we recognise that actually your services are delivering more complex work than we previously had thought, that then helps to get a greater share of the overall pot, and that sort of thing, or even just a recognition that we're doing more than we previously thought. So there's that sort of thing. And then the last one, what can be done to remove these, and what resource, calculating what resource that frees up, so you can work with your finance colleagues in order to work that out. So in terms of, we've been through most of the types of efficiency, but other areas to look at for efficiencies, GIRFT is, getting it right first time, if you're not familiar with it, is a really good source of information. If any of the areas you look after, or one of the areas that they have undertaken reviews on, there are some really good recommendations in there, and you can see if you're compliant with those recommendations and then assess whether there's opportunities there. The other areas are model hospital, which has its drawbacks, but actually you can at least see, who is the best performing, which trusts are the best performing trusts for your area within that. And even if it's just reaching out to those trusts to say, can we learn anything from the way that you do things? That is, a good indicator of where to go, where's sort of best practice. But as I say, there are drawbacks because it depends on how different organisations record activity, and whether your area is looking after a nationally recognised specialty. And I know that within NUH we have subspecialties that aren't necessarily recognised elsewhere. So that's why I say there are limitations, but it's a good indicator to see where you sort of lie against the national average. The other thing I would recommend is we collect reference costs for all areas within the trust. If you go to your finance team, they will be able to tell you how you benchmark against the national average compared with peers. So 100 is the sort of average, and if your service is at less than 100, then it indicates that you're operating more efficiently than the national average. So 97%, if your reference cost score was 97, you'd be 3% more cost effective than the national average. And don't overlook internal benchmarking opportunities. So one of my favourite ways to analyse performance of a service is to look at the performance over a period of time. So how much is it, what did you deliver with the same resource in previous years? Are you becoming more or less effective in terms of it could be activity, it could be, whatever your output is for your department. There's always an internal benchmarking metric that you can use, even within finance. So if I think about accounts payable, we can look at how many staff we've got and how many invoices that those staff process from year to year. So we get a good idea of, are we at least becoming, or at least maintaining our output per person compared with prior years. So there's always internal metrics that you can use. It's difficult when there's so many people on the call to, normally if it was a smaller group, I'd sort of reach out and ask, what areas you're working in, sort of generate some ideas. But if anyone wants to sort of follow up afterwards, my email address is in the slide deck that will be circulated. So happy to have those conversations, but just trying to give you some high level things to think about. So moving on to sort of the budget management side of things, that's the how to set a budget. So budget in terms of, so cost center is essentially a pool of costs that get attributed to a budget holder or budget manager. And that could be a department, or it could be for a group of staff, or effectively it's all of the resource that the budget holder is responsible for collected in one place. And so what you'll find usually as a budget holder or budget manager, you'll either have one or a number of cost centers that you're responsible for. And we essentially just group them in terms of either for a department or similar resources. So it could be medical staffing for ophthalmology, it could be a whole department there. The expense code, effectively, this is just the categories. So it helps to analyze the types of spend. So you've got you break it out by pay, non-pay, and then within that you'll have your different staffing groups, whether it's agency, whether it's substantive. And then again, for non-pay, we break it out into clinical supplies, telephone, all of that sort of thing. It just helps us to understand what we're spending the money on. So cost center is where, expense code is what the type of spend is. And then a budget variance is essentially where you've got a budget to live within. If you're spending more or less than the budget, then that indicates a variance and probably needs some investigation and some corrective action if necessary. It may be that you're spending more on clinical supplies, but if you're delivering more activity, then that would be expected. So investigation over. But if your supplies is going up and your activities remaining static, then I think there needs to be some investigation to understand, is that inflation, what's causing it, changing behaviours around purchasing or whatever. So that's when investigation's required. So this is an example. How familiar are you with budget statements, I suppose is the first question. So
yeah, seen them, but don't fully understand everything on them.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is just one of our standards. I've shared with you my budget statement. So luckily, I'm actually not overspent. So that's a good start. At least I'm practicing what I preach. Essentially, this is how we set them up, and most budget statements that I've seen are fairly similar. So you tend to start with your income, have your pay and non-pay down in your rows, and then across the columns we tend to look at the budgeted hold time, so how many staff you should have, and that's prorated based on one hold time, 37.5 hours, or 40 hours for medics. So we'll have, and we only look at the in month because otherwise you have to do like a year-to-date average, and that doesn't really tell you an awful lot when you're trying to get behind what's happening with your position. So essentially what this is telling me is I've got an in-month budget for 64.38 members of staff whole times, and I've got just under 48 that have worked in month, which means that I'm underspent or have less than planned by 16.5, which in and of itself might look like a positive thing, but actually it might not be a positive thing, because it might mean that you're unable to deliver on some of the services that you should be. So an overspend or more staff than is budgeted isn't always it isn't always a bad thing. It just means that it needs some further investigation. And equally, an underspend isn't always a good thing, because if it means that you can't deliver on your services, then that's something that needs to be addressed as well. But these tend to be what I call a symptom of what's going on in the services. So it tells you if there is a problem or if there's no problem, but there is always further investigation off the back of it. But anyway, so you have the in-month whole time equivalent. So you've got your budget, your actual, and then this is your variance. So what's the difference between the two? And then on the pounds side, you'll get your pounds budget. So effectively what those 64 should cost me. That's 284,000. What the 48 actually cost me, which is 208,000. Sorry, I'm just going to try and get to the chat. Yeah, so 16.43, 16 and a half. Essentially, if you've got people that are working part-time contracts, they'll show up. So say someone's on a 4-day a week, they'll show up as 0.8 of a whole time. It just reflects, if you were to convert everybody into a full-time for the full week, that's how many people you would have working for you. So would that impact? So for myself, it wouldn't. But if you were operating in a clinical area and you needed, I don't know, you needed all 65 in order to deliver all of the activity that was in your activity plan, then it most likely would impact on the income that you could deliver. Hence why I'm saying it's not always a good thing to have an underspend, because it might have a bigger corresponding under delivery of income, which usually is the case. So you can see my in-month performance, so budget, actual, variance. So starting, that's the summarised, that's the bottom line. But I was budgeted to deliver 10,500 worth of R&D. Actually delivered 9,000, so I'm 1,500 behind plan, and that's feeding into a pretty consistent trend. So if you go across to the year to date, that basically is, so this is the month 9 in-month position, and this, so December, and that's from April to December. You can see for 9 months, if you times that by 9, you're roughly going to get to, or times by 10, you roughly get there. So it's a fairly consistent picture, and that's why we have the in-month year to date, so you can sort of compare, have you got a problem in month, and what does that do to your year to date position? Because you can use your year to date underspends to move budget around to fund other things. So if you wanted to put someone on a training course, for example, I know that I've got £26,500 spare within my budget, and so I could utilise that for something else. And this tells me in what direction I'm travelling. So on my pay spend, so I've got a summarised budget view, but most of you will get a more detailed one. Mine goes off too many pages otherwise. But essentially, I've got an underspend on the senior staff within my team and also within the junior staff. So I clearly need to start recruiting, which we're on with, don't worry. And then on the non-pay side, we've got budget for £5,500 in month, and we've only spent 710. But what you can see is sometimes these things, the expenditures, technical term, lumpy, so it doesn't always come in the same month. So on my year-to-date expenditure, I'm actually overspent, and that's because a lot of the non-pay expenditure that I tend to have in my areas, it tends to be for like things like courses or software, and that cost tends to come in chunks. But the main thing is by the end of the year, and that's what these forecast budgets are, that will come back to plan. And so for my position, it will be, I'm actually, is that £3,000 behind plan. So I need to look at my position to going into the final few months to make sure that I break even. Now, we and most trusts tend, or organisations tend to show adverse variances in red, and that's how you can pick out something that means that you're either under delivering on income or overspending on expenditure, so either pay or non-pay. So that's essentially how to read it. Does that make sense? Is there anything else on there that doesn't make sense and I haven't explained? No? Okay, I shall move on. The other thing that you should get with your budget statement is an establishment report, so that you can see exactly who's getting paid to your areas. As you can see, I've got a lot of Joe blogs in mine just for IG reasons, but effectively what it tells you is by pay band, who you've got in which positions, and then you can see how many you've got budgeted and who's making up that, that 4.7 or the overall. So although I had 47.95 worked, I've got contracted 49.23, which means that one of my staff is probably off sick. Yeah, but although it's not on that page. So the difference between budget, contracted and worked. So the budget is essentially how many you're allowed to have working during the year or each month. The contracted is what your staff's contract says. So say I am one whole-time equivalent and I'm employed on a whole-time equivalent contract, I will show up as one whole-time equivalent in the contracted. If I've only worked for say 4 days a week during the month because I've had a period of sickness or whatever, or perhaps I've done some overtime and I'll like a day a week overtime, I'll show up as 1.2 in the worked. So that shows you what your staff are actually working as an equivalent to one whole-time equivalent. And then the variance essentially is the difference between what's worked and what's budgeted. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. So yes, this uses ClickSense software. So our budget statements have a lot of supplementary information, but I didn't want to show it all just because it's not available at all trusts. And so where some trusts will have quite static reports that just get fired out, whereas we've got, you can click on, say there was the overspend in somewhere in clinical supplies, you can click on that and then you can get like a transaction download, but most reports will have some sort of functionality to enable you to do that sort of thing. So how frequently do you think you should meet with your finance department as a budget holder?
We've been doing it monthly, but whether that's too frequent.
I think we
we do monthly as
quarterly.
well. No, we have monthly.
So what I would say is it does depend on the services and how volatile the financial position is. If you've got, say, if you look after or a budget holder for a cost centre that's fairly static, the cost centre contains like 4 or 5 members of staff that usually the posts are all filled and there's only a little bit of non-pay, say for postage or IT equipment, that quarterly is fine, but usually I would say monthly, because otherwise your position can drift quite a bit before you might be aware through your budget statement before you get the chance to meet with finance to understand what you can do about it. So monthly would be recommended, and we try and get our teams within FM at NUH to get out and meet monthly. Why do you think they're important?
You can just keep track of, like you said, if anything's varying, or so you're managing your budget effectively.
Yeah, yeah. So it is the protected time that you've got with your finance team to get a better understanding of what's happening. So within finance, we have access to a lot of information that can support you in undertaking your roles. So make the most of it is what I would say, and hold us to task. So, you know, if you don't understand something, you know, make sure you get an answer from us, because that's what we're there to do. We're there to help you get a better understanding of your financial position and what's driving it, and also to help you to come up with remedial action plans where they're necessary if you've got an overspend somewhere that you're trying to get on top of. So we are there to support you, so make the most of us. And what do you think you should do to prepare?
Have an updated staffing list of who's in post, if you're aware that they've done extra and vacant posts, etc.
Definitely, yes. So making sure you've reviewed the staffing list, knowing who you should have had working there and for how many shifts, hours, and comparing that back to the establishment reports that you do get, to make sure that they align, because if not, then that's a good indicator as to there may be somebody you're paying for that actually no longer works there, and that might indicate that a termination form hasn't been enacted, or a change form to move them somewhere else. So quite often those things either get missed or processed late, and this will enable you to pick those sorts of things up so they can be corrected for future. I would say review the statement, understand what question, you know, where you've got an understanding gap, so that you can, you know, have those questions ready for when you go into those meetings, and make sure you've completed your actions from the previous meeting, but also make sure that your finance colleague has also done the same. So it's your opportunity to hold them to account, to keep you sort of informed. So that's essentially, yeah. So just a quick slide on why being financially efficient is important. Quite often, so one of the recent talks I did to a group of anaesthetists, were they said, okay, well, this is all really good, but why is it important for us? You know, we're clinicians, and I suppose that there's a multitude of reasons, but it does have a direct impact or an indirect impact on patient care. So because of the constrained resources, there is unfortunately healthcare rationalisation. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with restricted access policies. They used to be called procedures of limited clinical value, but the terminology was quite emotive. So they've been changed to restrictive access policies. And essentially these are local to whichever area you're in, but they essentially restrict access to certain procedures because there is insufficient resource within those systems to be able to fund everything, and so they've rationed the least important. So things like the first things that went were things like removal of minor lumps and bumps, and that sort of thing. But now, so within Nottinghamshire, we've got one of the policies means that for cataract surgery, your best eye has to have deteriorated to 50% in order to qualify for access. So the finances do have an impact on the level of patient care that we're able to give. There are lost financial opportunities. So if whichever organisation you work within is deemed to be from NHS or NHS England now, sorry, of not effectively utilising your resources, then it makes it a lot more difficult to get access to centralised pots of money to fund service developments and big capital investment programmes, because they have less confidence in that organisation or that integrated care board's ability to spend it wisely. So those sorts of things are quite crucial. Also, if you can't get access to central pots of money, it means that you have to increase your borrowing. And that can be just to cover your cost base. So at NUH, we are running at a deficit currently. So that means that once the cash runs out, you have to then find other sources of money, and whether that comes through what's called a public dividend drawdown. So we draw it down. There are either interest payments from loans or dividend payments back for centrally drawn down money. And so there's a cost of that means that you can't then, when you're paying the interest on those, you can't then spend that on frontline care or services. And then there is an increased external scrutiny as well. I don't know if you're familiar with the single oversight framework from NHSE. I'm aware that we've now run up, I think I've run to the end of the session, so I probably need to wrap it up. But within the slide deck, there is some information on the NHSE single oversight framework, and there are some financial criteria that they measure organisations on. And based on that performance, determines how much intervention they can apply to your organisation. So they do have the ability to come in and put the organisation into turnaround and intervene in the operations of the organisation. What used to be called special measures, but is now part of the recovery support programme. So I'll leave it there, just conscious of time. Is there any questions before we sort of finally wrap up, or anything that I didn't cover that you were hoping to get out of the session? No? Okay. Oh, go on, Christine.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because a lot of our budget comes from things like funding for like research projects or Health Education England, that kind of thing, where payment of those funding opportunities often comes towards year end. And kind of, I suppose, would you have any tips for how you would deal with getting that spend spent? Because there's a lot of restrictions on what you can actually do with it and what you can carry over.
Be very friendly with your finance team, and there are ways of carrying it across. We just have to get a bit creative. It usually comes with accruing costs against the income. If you're struggling and you need me to sort of support your finance colleagues with how we try to deal with those problems, then I'm happy to support in that way. But it is tricky because from an audit perspective, they essentially want income to be recognised when you receive it, and if you've received the funding for hasn't been used, usually they would expect in a non-NHS organisation for the income to be deferred until you do want to spend it. So you don't recognise the income until you're actually going to use it. Only with the agreement of balances process in NHS that enables us to consolidate up into one set of accounts, that isn't possible unless you get agreement from the other organisation. And the reason they're giving you the money is because they want to get it out of their books. So that's why it becomes tricky.
That's exactly what we found.
Yeah, I feel your pain.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all. And if, as I say, the slides will be sent round and my details are in there. So if you do have any questions you think of subsequently, please do get in touch.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank
See ya.
you.
Thank you.